Marshall here. Welcome back to Counterbalance. Mike is out of town this week, so today I am flying solo for our crossover episode with Hudson Institute's other podcast, Making a Killing. Making a Killing is hosted by our colleague and Hudson Research Fellow, Nate Sibley, and it is a project of Hudson Institute's Kleptocracy Initiative. It covers how kleptocracy and corruption affects everything from U.S. forces on the battlefields in Afghanistan to organized crime to corruption across Europe, Latin America, and the African continent. There is so much to cover here. Nate is an amazing guest because he's capable of articulating why kleptocracy is truly a domestic and foreign policy threat in a way that is completely neutral. This is clearly coming from a point of analysis. This isn't purely ideological, and it really gets at what Hudson is trying to do with these projects and frankly with both of our podcasts. Interesting note, the Kleptocracy Initiative was established in 2014 before the huge items on this list, specifically corruption in Russia and in Venezuela, seized the headlines over the past 4 years. So it's good to see this as an example of how think tanks at their best can lean into trends and topics right before they're in the headlines and do really great work on a especially bipartisan basis so you can actually serve people and institutions as they're trying to navigate these difficult topics. If you'd like to learn more about the work of the Kleptocracy Initiative, Making a Killing, or the Counterbalance podcast, be sure to go to hudson.org. And a huge thank you to Hudson, of course, for supporting the work of the initiative and both of these podcasts. Let's dive into it. Nate Sibley, welcome to Counterbalance.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you. I'm excited to speak with you because this is our first ever Hudson Institute semi-crossover episode. You're a research fellow at Hudson's Kleptocracy Initiative, but most importantly, from my perspective, you're the host of the Making a Killing podcast, a podcast which I will say has a much better cover than ours does. So I will note that for the producers and the head honchos at Hudson who are clearly biased in favor of this other program and this other property. But let's start here, jokes aside. What is the Kleptocracy Initiative? Introduce us to the work you're doing, but also just what kleptocracy itself is.
Sure. Thanks so much, Marshall, again, for having me on. So kleptocracy, it's a bit of a strange word. It's a bit of a new word for many people. It literally means rule by thieves, in the same way that democracy means rule by the people. And the basic idea is that if you look at all the authoritarian regimes around the world, they are economically structured as kleptocracies in some to a greater or lesser extent. That is, that the ruling elite will engage in corrupt practices to support their rule at home, to entrench their sort of patronage networks domestically. But then increasingly, because we're in a globalized economy, they see no qualms about projecting those corrupt practices around the world. So corruption is having an increasingly corrosive effect on democratic institutions, as well as the effect that we all understand and see around the world across the developing world and the post-communist world, where it causes untold sort of poverty and security crises, all the rest of it. So Hudson first started looking at this issue in 2014, I think it was, just after Putin invaded Crimea. The idea was that policymakers in DC and Western Europe were still not really thinking about our authoritarian adversaries or competitors, whatever word we're supposed to use these days, as these corrupt, criminal, mafia-like regimes. And that was inhibiting our ability to influence their behavior and reduce malign conduct by them. And so the idea, particularly with Putin invading Crimea, was that Russia is in many ways the archetypal, the most well-known kleptocracy. And many people, when you say kleptocracy, will now think of Russian oligarchs flashing their cash in London, driving around in Lamborghinis, buying penthouses in Miami, whatever it is. And so the idea is that as we floundered for a kind of response to this very hard-nosed territorial aggression by the Russian regime, actually, Putin and his inner circle had made the mistake of burying their stolen treasure in our own backyard, because when they steal money from the Russian people, they almost never keep it in Russia itself. They launder it out through tax havens, places like Cyprus or Malta, or Latvia or wherever it may be. And then it ends up at developed financial centers like London, like New York, like Miami, like Dubai. And so we have jurisdiction over those places. Not all their stolen money is there, but a good amount of their personal fortune was, as I said, buried in our own backyard. And we weren't using that as leverage, and we weren't exposing that and showing solidarity with the people whose money had been stolen, who look at us and see that these oligarchs and things flashing around in our countries and think that we're part of the problem sometimes, that we're complicit.
So before we go into more specifics, I'd like you to set the stage a bit. How new is the broader dynamic around kleptocracy? So obviously the Hudson Initiative focuses in 2014 during the invasion of Crimea, but obviously, and almost certainly going back to the 1990s, kleptocracy was a broader issue. So can you just speak about kleptocracy from a historical perspective?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the term first pops up in, I think it's like in Spanish, some Spanish history document or something in the 1800s. I'll have to look it up again. But it's almost unused until sort of the Cold War. That's when you had the Soviet Union and the US kind of competing over different countries around the world for influence, and often turning a blind eye and sometimes encouraging dictators and so on and so forth. As long as they were sort of aligned with our interests and supporting our interests, we were happy to sort of hand over boatloads of cash and so on and so forth. But then I think the issue really took off. The issue accelerated. I would argue we weren't aware enough of it at the end of the Cold War, because as political elites in those countries, in the developing world, the post-communist world particularly, suddenly, party officials became politicians. Mafia figures became "quote-unquote" businessmen in these places. They suddenly had access and control of state, the resources of entire countries. On independence, at the end of or at the end of the Cold War, when they, from the Soviet Union or wherever it may be. At the same time, we had a rapidly globalizing economy, so they suddenly had access to the global financial system. They had access to lawyers, bankers, professionals in Western countries who are very happy to help them kind of steal money and launder it out, as I described just now. So that process really accelerated. And you see a huge. The figures are always, very unreliable in this field for obvious reasons. It's illicit finance, but we know there was an explosion of transnational corruption at the end of the Cold War and the advent of globalization. But in terms of public awareness and really getting this on policymakers' radar, I think this really came to the fore in 2016 for two main reasons. And just to sort of rewind, we were founded in 2014. I joined in very early 2016. KI is sort of an example of Hudson can sometimes, it's a true think tank, and it can sometimes be a bit sort of ahead of itself. And KI was occupying this sort of pokey office in the back, sort of working on this issue that would soon become really, really big. And then in 2016, I think it did really become very big. And as I said, there were two reasons. The first was the Panama Papers, which was a leak of documents, financial records from a law firm based in Panama called Mossack Fonseca. And what these showed was the way and the extent to which not only the wealthiest people in the world, but also criminals, kleptocrats, people linked to terrorism were using the offshore financial system to launder money around the world. It actually resulted in the resignation of a prime minister, for example. I think it was in Iceland, and senior public officials all around the world. It was a really huge scandal. And then the other thing, so that sort of exposed for the first time, I think, to a lot of journalists, the media particularly, but then also by extension public awareness, the way that this whole parallel economy had grown up offshore. And it wasn't just tax avoidance that the way it's usually framed that was the problem. We're also, criminals were also using these loopholes to launder money and facilitate their activities. The second big thing, which was slightly more controversial, obviously, was the election of Donald Trump in the US. Because that immediately kicked off the whole allegations that he was somehow sort of one of the extreme, like a Manchurian candidate for Russia. That he was a Russian agent who had been planted at the heart of the American political system, and then at the other end, maybe that he, in his life as a real estate developer, had inadvertently laundered money for wealthy Russians, and that they were somehow now using that as leverage over him. There were any number of theories, as you know, and they all kind of came and went during the Russia investigation. But what the Russia regardless of what you think of the Russia investigation, Trump himself, we don't need to sort of go down that rabbit hole today. I think everyone's tired of that whole thing. But it did expose massively the extent to which the political elite in the US is financially entangled with some of the most corrupt countries on earth. And it showed the extent to which authoritarian regimes will try and push their luck in terms of interfering in democracies. Now, that you don't need to think that happened in 2016 with Donald Trump to appreciate the risk of it happening. Because what it showed was there were all these vulnerabilities in our democratic armor, in the way that we defend our economy from the corrosive influence of dirty money from regimes like Russia. Things like shell companies. We always think of the US as kind of the leader of the rules-based, capitalist, system. One of the things that I've worked on over the past 18 months is this issue of shell companies. The US was operating until January of this year as the world's biggest tax haven. It was one of the places on earth it was possible to create a shell company and use it for money laundering without ever having to disclose who you are to the government. That was just one thing, just one example of all these different little chinks in our armor that we became aware of in 2016 through the Panama Papers, through the furore around the Russia investigation.
There's so many questions there, actually. So one, which
sorry,
people are
that's
probably
a lot to
wondering,
hit you with.
No, in a good way. How did you get into this space? Let's start with you. I don't think there are many people who wake up and say, you know what, kleptocracy. I don't think that was your immediately post-university ambition, or maybe it wasn't. But yeah, I'd love to hear about that.
No, absolutely. So I, as you can hear, I come from the UK. I'm a US citizen as well now. I didn't know about this at all until I started working at Hudson. Frankly, I trained as a lawyer in the UK and I worked in Parliament for 2 MPs, just as a general sort of researcher. I moved to the Middle East for a couple of years with my wife, who also works at Hudson Institute now, just to make the podcast even more incestuous. And I worked as for a British PR company in Qatar, in Doha, for 2 years, just as a sort of a speechwriter. So really nothing at all to do with international illicit financial flows and so on. And when I came to the US, I met the guy who founded the Kleptocracy Initiative at Hudson, who's Charles Davidson, who's been involved in a lot of sort of financial transparency initiatives over the years, and a real sort of a visionary on that front. And he was the director of Kleptocracy Initiative, and so we had some really good conversations. I came to work at Hudson, and I've just sort of rolled with it from there. But I think probably more interesting than my personal experience is the extent to which there aren't that many people who have been working on this side of things, and that if a guy who's only been working on this really for 5 years is one of the people who's talking about this in DC, and it's now one of the major sort of security foreign policy concerns for the US, I would hope that it's going to be something that people do leave university thinking that, I'd like to work on that, because we need as many experts and many people with skills as we can working on this, in my view.
So the next question is, especially in reference to your point about the Panama Papers, where does information about this corruption tend to come out? Because obviously there's a lot of controversy with leaks. In the Snowden context specifically, that's one where a lot of folks in the Hudson space and the audience are going to be deeply unsympathetic to that fact. Sure. But I think given what you articulated on the Panama Papers dynamic, I think that's one where, hey, it seems great that corruption would be outed in comparison to national security information. So how generally does that space work, and how do you all think about accessing and discovering information?
Sure. So it's a really great question. I'm so glad you asked that, because it goes to the heart of how we counter this threat ultimately. Because the whole point is that this is illicit activity. Kleptocrats want to do what they do anonymously. They do not want to get caught. They do not want the media spotlight on them. And so accessing that information is the way that we deal with this problem ultimately. And so you're right. So often these things will start with a whistleblower or a leak of some kind. And I am one of those in the Hudson space who probably share the majority view on the Snowden leaks as being, illegitimate and unhelpful and dangerous, frankly. But when we're talking about something like the Panama Papers or some of the subsequent leaks, things like they have names like the Paradise Papers, the Launder leaks. There's a model of investigative journalism now, which specializes in probably the biggest development in sort of counter kleptocracy, measures is not a government thing in the past few years. It's the way that journalists have decided to work on these transnational issues. In the past, you would get, a leak would be made to a newsroom. A journalist would be told to sit there and go through X million number of documents and come up with a story out of it. And that was not an efficient or useful way to try and approach these things. Because, of course, no journalist can do that on their own, and no newsroom often can handle that level of data on their own. So what these journalists have been doing, led by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, they just collaborate and they all share out the stories at the end. So instead of having one or two journalists working a story, you have hundreds of journalists working through these complicated legal financial documents that on the face of it are just that, really boring documents, but taken together can tell an amazing story of offshore corruption, skullduggery, and so on and so forth. So leaks is one side of it. And we have actually had an interesting, you alluded to the sort of the ethical issues and the legal issues around leaks. And there are some which, as I said, everyone agrees were fine. The Panama Papers being the chief example, because that was just like a corrupt offshore law firm. And it serves them right, frankly. I think it was everyone's prevailing view. More recently, we've had one called the FinCEN files. Now, this is very different because it involved the leak of reports of suspicious activity that have been made by banks about their own customers, as they are legally obliged to do, to the U.S. Treasury. So this was going a bit beyond, in my view, what was right and proper, unless there was a compelling sort of public interest reason to do it. In that, we're now not leaking stuff from corrupt offshore law firms. We're leaking stuff from, the unit within Treasury, which is tasked with defending us from illicit finance. So maybe that's, that's a good example of where, the anti-corruption community was a bit split on that. In terms of like places that you actually just, access this information. So yes, whistleblowers, leaks, but, those are only going to come along when they come along. So one of our key proposals at KI is just to sort of institutionalize better financial transparency in order that we can, and law enforcement particularly, and investigative journalists can access as much information as they can without, infringing on privacy rights or certainly safety rights of people they're investigating. And so I mentioned the Shell company issue earlier. That's probably the best example and the biggest victory we've had on that front, in that we didn't have this register, this registry of the beneficial ownership of Shell companies in the US before. It was mandated by Congress in January. It sounds super nerdy, and it is when you get into the technical details, but basically it means this. Before, there was no way for law enforcement to check who owned companies in the United States. That meant if I'm a kleptocrat, I want to get my money to a safe, wealthy economy, and I want to do it anonymously. Well, I'm going to use an American shell company because, there's so many benefits that come with, controlling an American company. I can get my lawyer to set this up, put his name on the paperwork. My name never needs to go anywhere near it. I think it was one of the Rockefellers said the key is to control everything but own nothing, and that has never been more true than for contemporary kleptocrats. So the key to countering kleptocracy is, yes, aggressive law enforcement, all the rest of it, but to do, the foundation of that is a more transparent financial system where we can access who owns things, who's moving assets around, who's paying who to do what. With the huge asterisk, I don't want to impinge on. I'm not after radical transparency here. I don't want to see what's in your bank account. I don't want to be able to go online and see that. I certainly don't want people going on having a laugh at what's in my bank account. But if I own a company and I'm using it to move money around, maybe law enforcement should be able to see that I'm doing that. So there is a balance there.
I'm going to cause trouble for certain members of the audience with this question, but I'm just genuinely curious. I'm pro cryptocurrency, but with every single use case you're describing, it seems like there's an opportunity for kleptocrats, people engaged in illicit finance, to use cryptocurrency as a very straightforward way of committing these types of acts. How do you all think about that from a regulatory and just framework perspective?
Yeah, I mean, you're quite right that my gut reaction is that they're not good news for the fight against international money laundering and global corruption and kleptocracy. Because they allow people precisely to do that, to move money and anonymously. They can bypass all the traditional, anti-money laundering regulations we have in place, anti-corruption laws, and so on, and maintain. And some of them have been very popular with authoritarian regimes for that reason. A prominent example I can think of is North Korea using Monero to pay for things for its nuclear program. But it's not quite as straightforward as you'd think, because so firstly, I think the US government is kind of on top of this. They've regulated cryptocurrency exchanges as they do banks when it comes to anti-money laundering. So if you want to be legit digital currency like exchange, you're going to have to file suspicious activity reports to the Treasury on your customers. And if you don't, you can be fined pretty badly and prosecuted even. And they've gone after rogue cryptocurrency exchanges overseas very aggressively. So they've shut down a number of the biggest ones operating in like Eastern Europe. Using the power of the US dollar, the reach of US law enforcement, they've been able to do that. So I think they are very aware of the risk. There's another sort of twist to the sort of idea that cryptocurrencies are helping the bad guys, in that with the traditional sort of secrecy money laundering vehicles I mentioned before, the shell companies laundering money through banks and into maybe like real estate or high value goods, it's a bit you're able to still do that without putting your name on the paper anywhere. And if the law enforcement gets into that network, they might be able to trace the ownership of 2 or 3 shell companies, and then the trail goes cold because they just don't have a name to keep going. But the opposite is potentially true with some of these cryptocurrencies, in that if they get the name of one person on the ledger, that if they get hold of one real person or one real name or one real address of anyone involved on either side of these huge web-like transactions, they could potentially get that whole network in one fell swoop, because everything's on the ledger. They have all the evidence right there in front of them. They have all the numbers that this money was being pinged around to. So in my conversations with law enforcement, I've heard mixed things. They're not as worried as you'd think they would be, but they are well out. They are trying to keep ahead of that threat in the view that, because it does have such potential to sort of disrupt things on that front. So it's a really interesting topic for all sorts of reasons, but also in the world of kleptocracy.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. So what I'm wondering next is, our conversation has been very, for obvious reasons, Russia-centric. And this gets into the podcast and what you're covering, like what are the other regimes, locations, continents, etc., where these discussions of kleptocracy are focused?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Russia has definitely had the most press on this front because of the Russia investigation, because of it's probably the most obvious and least most brazen. It commands the least, perhaps the least loyalty from its own lieutenants. Like they frequently turn, an exposure. But so I think actually it's maybe not the worst example of a kleptocracy in the world, which is a bit of a controversial statement. And it was one that was made by an event we had at Hudson Institute last week with interim president of Venezuela, Juan Guaido, and his commissioner for economic crimes affairs, Carlos Paparoni. And if you look at what has happened to Venezuela, the speed and the rapacity with which the Maduro regime and the Chavez regime before it have hollowed out what was once the wealthiest economy in South America. I think in terms of a fall from grace and the just showing, there are obviously some parts of the world, sub-Saharan Africa, which have always sadly been poor. They have kleptocratic leaders who have plunged them even further into poverty. There's no reason Venezuela should be in that situation. It should be the thriving economic hub of Latin America, if not just South America. And so, Commissioner Paparoni mentioned last week that he thinks, and I've heard this from other people, so anywhere up to $400 billion has been stolen by the Maduro regime. And it's sitting in bank accounts around the world. It's sitting in shell companies. It's sitting in real estate. It's sitting in investments in like Russian oil companies and stuff, just all over the place. And it's going to be very difficult for Venezuela to come back from that. It's occasioned like the worst humanitarian crisis in the Western Hemisphere. Up to 6 million Venezuelans have been forced to flee their own country. I think 4 million of them are now like just sheltering nearby in Colombia because they've just lost everything, because the Maduro regime has it began by stripping out profits and payments from the state oil company. A classic example of what we call like the resource curse. A country has this one particularly valuable revenue stream and a not particularly well-developed economy otherwise. And of course, everyone starts political competition over control of the revenue streams around that. It's almost always oil or gas or something like that. And Venezuela is the classic case of that. They stripped out everything they could from the country's oil wealth. They then moved to involvement in shadier stuff. So they for example, they've run corruption schemes involving the exchange mechanisms with the US dollar, privileged access to preferential exchange rates for wealthy Venezuelan members of Maduro's elite. They have stolen from food programs directly, the humanitarian things that have been external parties have tried to direct to the Venezuelan people. They have, and most scarily, they are engaged in the drug trafficking industry. And Maduro himself was, in a sort of unprecedented step, was actually indicted for drug trafficking by the United States. So I know we don't recognize him as a head of state, but it's pretty strange for the US to indict someone criminally who is in fact acting as a head of state in command of the security services and so on. And that's what Maduro's really done. He's used the entire resources of the Venezuelan state to prop up his criminal empire. He's now sending military units to protect parts of the country where his drug mafia is operating. They are strip mining gold from the Orinoco Basin and causing what our colleague Marshall Billingsley has called like an ecocide there. So they are just doing everything they can. And this is where it gets more towards maybe your audience's usual diet from this podcast is the sort of international aspect to this, which is reaching around for allies and external support. Maduro has enlisted the support of all the other most odious kleptocratic regimes on earth. So he's receiving oil shipments, from Iran, and has allowed Hezbollah to establish itself as a major force in the country, as a beachhead for Iranian operations in the Western Hemisphere. Russia has been very closely involved in supporting the Maduro regime with loans, with financial support. I read somewhere smuggling its gold out as well. And helping it in exchange for cash, again, trying to prop up the regime. And in fact, at the moment when, I think it was in 2019, when Venezuela seemed on the verge of a democratic transition, in the middle of that dreadful period when Guaido did declare himself to be the constitutional president, and everyone was out on the streets, Maduro was reportedly, again, our Hudson Institute colleague Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State at the time, said that Maduro was on his way to the airport in a car. He was ready to throw it all in and leave Venezuela to be rebuilt by Guaido and the democratically elected thing. But the Russians leaned on him and told him to stay. They said, "You're a person in South America, and you're staying in place." And they convinced him to stay, and we're in this terrible situation we're in now. The Chinese as well have been financially deeply involved. And I think I read somewhere, can't remember if it's 30 billion or 300 billion. There's quite a big difference, but that kind of those kinds of billions and billions of dollars.
The B is all that matters.
I mean,
here.
when it's that much money, does it really matter? Your economy has collapsed. Your currency's in free fall and has been for years. I mean, there's not much that we can do. If Venezuela ever does go to democratic transition, those kinds of numbers are just going to be all over the place, and we're going to have a real mess to try and help them sort out their country. Which many of them, I believe, really strongly want to do.
Yeah, the immediate question that comes to mind here is, anyone who's listening to this, nothing you're saying feels particularly partisan or ideological. So can you just speak about how your space is operated with the transition to the Biden administration and how people broadly think about this space, even during the Trump administration? Because I always have noticed that a lot of bipartisan energy within Hudson really comes through and centers around this program. So I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, sure. No, thank you. That's a very good and interesting and a slightly unusual point about the kleptocracy issue, is that it remains very bipartisan in Congress and in the approaches that successive administrations have taken to it. There was obviously a lot of controversy around the Trump administration, the president's personal dealings. I view some of them as corrupt personally, not legally perhaps, but not really what the leader of the free world should be doing. Again, we don't need to go down that rabbit hole. But he wasn't himself maybe the cheerleader for anti-corruption efforts that the US needed. His administration, on the other hand, did some amazing stuff with bipartisan support. As we've talked about Venezuela, they sanctioned the living daylights out of everyone involved and indicted the living daylights out of anyone involved in Venezuelan corruption. The Global Magnitsky sanctions program, which allows the US to sanction people for human rights and corruption abuses, could have fallen by the wayside. It was signed in under Obama. It was expanded under President Trump. So that kind of runs counter. And we didn't see the big dips in sort of law enforcement action against things like foreign bribery and anti-money laundering breaches that, many on the left were kind of screaming about they expected to happen under Trump as he kind of like opened the America up to becoming a kleptocracy itself. It didn't happen. His administration kind of maintained. Going into the Biden administration, Biden has explicitly said this is a top three priority for his summit of democracies that he intends to hold, and that we've seen the importance of this issue in a number of appointments that he's made, particularly the National Security Council, people who really understand this issue. And I think the president himself has written he set out his foreign policy vision in a foreign affairs piece a couple of years ago before he was elected, obviously, talked at length about the role of shell companies, even going into that level of detail. So what I'd like to see a bit more of from the Biden administration, I don't think they've necessarily, they talk the talk. I'm not sure that they are yet walking the walk, though I appreciate they had a long transition period that extended into their own, their own period. So I think we're going to see a lot more from them on that front. In Congress, yeah, you're quite right. This has just consistently been a bipartisan issue. Even as you have, I find it bizarre myself sometimes, you have, Democratic lawmakers standing up, hurling abuse about the Trump family's corruption. And then on the other side of the aisle, you've got Republican lawmakers standing up, hurling abuse about Hunter Biden and his ties to Ukraine and China. These very partisan, vicious sort of like debates about corruption. But then in the background, I think, to their credit, most officers realize that this is a systemic problem, and that whichever side of the aisle you're on, you're going to get caught up in this stuff eventually if we don't do something to try and fix it. And that's why so many of the things that I work on do enjoy bipartisan support. I work as much with Democrats as I do Republicans. The big anti-money laundering upgrade that I mentioned, banning shell companies and other things that Congress passed in January of this year, completely bipartisan. The biggest anti-money laundering upgrade since September 11th attacks and the Patriot Act. So really significant. And there is this narrative that people can't work together and that Capitol Hill just isn't working. I don't experience that at all in my day job, I'm afraid. I'm happy to say. It doesn't reflect. And I think that the reason, just if I may, like a sort of ranting a bit, but I do think it's important to understand how and why that happened. Because traditionally, anti-corruption was thought of as kind of like a left-leaning issue in that, people viewed it as like a poverty alleviation thing. This is what USAID did. This is what NGOs, people like Oxfam and stuff like that, this is what they're into. And I think one of the innovations of the Kleptocracy Initiative and many other scholars, I must say, working on this issue around DC now, has been to not transform the narrative, but highlight exactly the national security, the foreign policy.
This isn't philanthropy. That's the key thing.
What's that?
I think the key takeaway of what I'm just hearing is there's a way of seeing anti-corruption as this philanthropic do-gooder activity versus like actually there. And once again, that's not to make an argument against that framework, but I think that what I was introduced through your work and the work of the initiative is this idea that there are these deeper, very self-interested implications across the globe in all these different contexts to this type of stuff.
No, absolutely. And it's, this isn't Americans. You sometimes see like Americans complaining about foreign intervention, foreign aid as being like, why don't we take care of our own at home, first? I don't see this as anything but that. This is the defense of the US financial system and our democratic institutions, but also, Biden talks about a foreign policy for the middle class, which is very, very catchy. Well, there could be no better foreign policy for the middle class than to create a level playing field for American businesses worldwide. And when, again, it goes to this sort of strange meaning of kleptocracy, like most people are thinking of a Cold War African despot sitting on a pile of gold, or they're thinking of, Russian oligarchs in London. I would argue like the biggest and most frightening manifestation of kleptocracy today is what is being practiced by the Chinese Communist Party in terms of forced technology transfer. What is that if that's not extortion? Now, like that's classic kleptocracy. It just because it's been being done on a scale and by a country with the prestige of China, we don't think of it that way. And because Chinese officials, yes, there is rampant corruption in terms of bribery and stuff in China, but they don't have seem to have the same institutional problem with it as the Russians or even certainly the Venezuelans do. And so, if we're talking about economic competition with China, creating a level playing field is surely the most important thing we can do there. And the other thing is like, beyond the economic side of the economic arguments for countering kleptocracy, this stuff is increasingly coming home, which is the first thing I mentioned. This stuff is increasingly coming home to roost right here in the US. There was a great report, I think it was the Pittsburgh Gazette or something, recently about how a Ukrainian oligarch called Ihor Kolomoisky, who is accused of running what, if he's convicted, will be the biggest money laundering scheme in history, the theft of $5.5 billion from a Ukrainian bank, which the Ukrainian government then had to bail out, which the Americans and the IMF then had to step in and bail out the Ukrainian government. So that is US taxpayer dollars start off. But this guy was, where had this guy laundered all that money to? Well, it turns out he's the major landowner in downtown Cleveland, Ohio. And he had invested it in steel mills across the US. But he hadn't invested it in them, as a money-making enterprise, like a sort of American entrepreneur might want to do. He was using them to park stolen money, away from the eyes of Ukrainian law enforcement. And in consequence, that no effort was put into these steel mills, and they basically all sorts of horrible health and safety concerns. The buildings start collapsing. American workers were burnt, by these safety failures. So, and that's the case we know about. That's the whole point of my issue, is that I'm always frightened that the biggest case is the one that we haven't heard of yet, because of the very nature of it is anonymity and secrecy.
That is an excellent place to leave it. So here's the big final question. A, where can people find your work? And then B, where are you excited to delve into next? Because what I've loved about this conversation is y'all's work has been very event-driven, in the sense that there's this period in 2014 with Crimea, there's 2016 with the conversations around corruption there, and then we're now in this new period, COVID-19, what the world's going to look like next. Where are you excited to delve into next?
Yeah, sure. To answer your first question, Hudson.org is always a great place to start, but I really hope that people will, in addition to listening to your wonderful podcasts, will sign up for Making a Killing, which is the Kleptocracy Initiative's podcast. We've had some incredible guests on so far. I mentioned Marshall Billingsley, the former Assistant Secretary at the Treasury, who led the US kind of efforts to take on Maduro's kleptocracy. We've had activists and campaigners from Ukraine, from Malta. I've had other government officials from the Department of Justice who work on seizing kleptocrats' assets. So what I'm trying to do with the podcast is highlight the problem, talking to people on the front lines, journalists and campaigners and so on, but also the solutions. So talking to US officials engaged in fighting illicit finance and policymakers throughout the DC community. So where are we going? Where are we going next? It's a great question, because, as you say, the struggle so far has been to convince policymakers that this is an issue at all. They were still very much in the mindset of tanks and bombs and stuff like that is how we defend ourselves in the modern world, and introducing this idea that there is a financial vector to the confrontation between democracy and authoritarianism. The counterpart is rule of law versus kleptocracy, and that's really what my project is about. And so I'm in a great position, and very happy to say now that we are working with the Hill, we are working with the new administration and governments around the world to try and explore these ways that we can close off these vulnerabilities. We talked about shell companies. There's a lot more we can do on that front. There's also, lobbying by foreign governments in the heart of Washington, D.C. That's a big problem. Need a lot more disclosure around that. We need stronger anti-money laundering safeguards at banks. I could go on and on and on, and I will if you don't shut me up. So as the audience probably knows by now, but there is so much to do. So I don't think we'll be going away anytime soon, sadly.
It's good and bad news. I'm glad that you will continue to be employed and doing your work. It's also bad that this issue is going to continue on moving forward. Well, Nate, thank you so much for joining. Everyone, be sure to check out Making a Killing, also produced by our amazing joint producer, Phil Hegseth. It's been really great to have you on the show and also highlight the work that Hudson is doing in this space. It's genuinely deeply important, obviously, and I just love your articulation of the point that this was an issue that was focused on in 2014 before it became quite as in the news, because if we're thinking about what think tanks are supposed to do, it's this. And it's just good to see demonstrations of the model and the framework working for everyone. So congratulations, and look forward to listening to more of your show.
Thank you so much, Marshall. I've really enjoyed it.
Hope you enjoyed the episode. Mike and I will be back next week with more Counterbalance. We'll be back to our 2-man interview format, which we know you all missed. And if you would like to learn more about making a killing, we're going to drop the trailer to the show right here for the rest of the episode. And if you'd like to learn more about anything else, please go to hudson.org. See you next week.
A blockbuster release of millions of financial documents has European and Asian leaders running for political cover, and some even trying to hold off calls for their removal. The so-called Panama Papers paint a picture of widespread corruption and tax evasion by wealthy and famous people from a number of countries.
Associates of Mr. Putin ran a clandestine network operated by Putin associates that has shuffled at least $2 billion through banks and offshore companies.
These Russian oligarchs are spending billions buying up properties in Europe and the U.S., and they go to incredible lengths to hide it.
Several top officials of soccer's world governing body were arrested in a massive bribery scandal. U.S. prosecutors say briefcases full of cash decided media and marketing rights, even the site of the World Cup.
When we look at the threats to that rule of law world, whether it is that we will be the victims of crime, of cyber attack, of intellectual property theft, of terrorism, all of those hazards emerge from the territories that are controlled by the great bands of robbers.
Hello and welcome to Making a Killing, a new podcast on how corruption is reshaping global politics. I'm Nate Sibley, a research fellow at Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. And for the past 5 years, I've worked on a project called the Kleptocracy Initiative, studying the relationship between corruption and authoritarianism. Kleptocracy literally means rule by thieves. And in this series, we'll examine how it exploded in the aftermath of the Cold War, as political leaders siphoned trillions of dollars out of the world's poorest countries into offshore tax havens and financial centres like London and New York. We'll explore how corruption continues to fuel some of the most deadly security threats facing the world today, from the battlefields of Afghanistan and Iraq to nuclear proliferation, terrorist networks, drug trafficking, and other organised crime. And we'll find out how dangerous authoritarian leaders increasingly use corruption as a tool of statecraft to enrich themselves and their families, to maintain their grip on power, and to project malign influence beyond their borders. But above all, I'll be searching for solutions that can help the United States and other democracies to start fighting back. Scarcely a day goes by now without American politics being further tainted by scandals involving dubious foreign entanglements. That's no coincidence. It's happening because the longer we refuse to look squarely at the problem of corruption, the more corrupt we start to look ourselves. To understand how that may finally be changing, I'll be keeping you abreast of all the latest developments, as well as introducing you to leading experts and top government officials from the front line of America's fight against dirty money. The 20th century was defined by what are now familiar struggles between democracy and dictatorship, capitalism and communism. But in the hyper-connected 21st century, the threat posed by corrupt authoritarian regimes isn't nearly so clear-cut. So I hope you'll join me on this journey into the darker corners of the global economy, as we explore how kleptocrats, and those in the West who enable them, are quite literally making a killing.